We should be.
Great. Well, we'll go ahead and call the first meeting of the Virginia Solar Energy Development and Energy Storage Authority of 2024 to order. We have a couple new members, and I know we'll probably have a few members joining online. So I think it might be useful to start briefly with some introductions. To start over here with our director.
Glenn Davis, the director of the Department of Energy and Recovering Politician.
And Ken German, Department of Energy. Greg Beebe, I'm a partner in Gentry Lock and the president of Gentry Lock Consulting.
Skylar Zunk with Energy Right.
I'm Joanne Scott Webb. I'm a landowner who likes solar, has done it, and wants to do more.
Jim Colberry, I'm one of the new members, currently retired, but with a career nuclear submariner, 28 years. Highlight was command of a fast attack submarine back in the late 90s. Most recently, I was chief of staff to the Secretary of Energy in past administration.
Mike Herbert, co-founder and managing partner at DeLorean Power. We're a standalone battery storage developer, owner operator.
Good morning, I'm Catherine Bond, with Dominion Energy.
Morning, Joe Lurch with Virginia Association of Counties, here as a guest. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. And welcome to Jim. Ken, do we have any members joining remotely that we could make a motion to include them in the discussions?
Well, we don't have a quorum, physical quorum, 1, 2, 5, 6. We have 7, we need 8.
Thought we had it with 7. We have 12 members.
We're up to 14.
All right, good and a bad thing. If we have one more, Colleen joins,
Then we're good to go.
then we could make a motion to include folks joining remotely.
And I don't see Harry online. There he is. He's on. And can the folks online hear us?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Welcome to the many folks joining online as well. But with that, not having reached a quorum quite yet, we will put a pin in the approval of the minutes from our most recent meeting. We'll go ahead and kick things off with our discussion with Joe Lurch, Director of Local Government Policy at Virginia Association of Counties. Thank you, Joe, so much for joining us today. We have anxiously awaited this presentation and discussion with you, recognizing how important the county voices are in this discussion to bring more clean energy online in Virginia. I think we'll listen into what you have to say and share, and then I think we could engage in a discussion. I think everyone would enjoy that. So thank you, and the floor is yours.
Well, yeah, so thank you again for having me, and I'm going to make this relatively informal. Some of you I know, I've known for years, and others I just met now, so it's nice to meet you. I thought what I would do is just kind of tell kind of a narrative of what the counties have seen really over the past, I would say, 10 to 12 years, in terms of the energy landscape in Virginia. And then how that fits into utility scale solar and battery storage or other types of energy storage. So, prior to really 2015, the types of solar that, we were seeing in our communities were really big rooftop arrays, things that might get as much as 800 kV in capacity. And then really the first big project we saw was in Accomack, which was an 80 megawatt project. And that really got everybody's attention in a lot of different ways. To speak of the context too, I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar, 1 megawatt of solar panels. It really depends on the context and the situation, but it can take up anywhere from 6 to 10 acres of land. That's kind of a rule of thumb. By context, prior to that kind of first big utility scale solar, when we were looking at energy projects in our communities, and I'm glad I've got the meeting here because they can correct me if I'm wrong with some of the numbers, but I think it's the Greensville gas plant was one of the more recently permitted ones. And I think that was like 1,333 megawatt capacity. And it took up maybe about 56, 57 acres. And so in terms of, how, counties kind of view this, it's a different type of energy, right? It's very different. So to compare, it is an energy production, but to compare the two, you really have to keep that in mind. In terms of land use though, when you're talking, at first we were seeing a lot of 20 megawatt facilities, and that's, a couple hundred acres. But once we started getting to 150 megawatt and above, you're starting to talk about square miles of land that are being changed over to another use. And so the way the counties really view these things are like any other land use application, which is, all right, what are the impacts? First off, actually, how does it fit into our comprehensive land use plans, which every locality must have? And then they look at that, and typically what we've seen is these are being applied for in agricultural zones, right? And in those agricultural zones, they'll have a combination of existing land uses. It might be for agriculture, row crops, it might be pasture, it might be forested. There might be nothing going on in the land. And so you have this changeover. And so what the counties are looking at is, okay, how does it fit in with our land use plans for there? They typically will require a special use permit. So the underlying zoning is still for agriculture and all those uses there. And then typically what the special use permit does is it looks at, okay, within this zoning district, we're going to go ahead and take an application for use, whether it's utility scale solar, energy storage, and we're going to try to see how we can address those impacts. It usually goes then to the planning commission, with a staff report. There's a public hearing, people come and show and speak in favor or, in opposition, or sometimes just not necessarily in favor of opposition. They're trying to figure out, what is going on here and try to get some impacts. And then that planning commission will then make a recommendation to the county board. It could be to approve, it could be to deny. In some cases, they may not have any recommendation because there might be a tie of the members present. And then you would have a public hearing before the elected body, the local board of supervisors, and then they would make their decision. Now, one of the things that too, I didn't mention, as a part of this process, there is going to be a unique thing in state law, and it's called the 2232 review, which some of you are probably very familiar with if you're in the business. And essentially, this is any public utility, and by definition, utility scale solar comes under that definition of public utility in state code. It has to, the planning commission has to make a determination, does this fit within our comprehensive land use plan? And that's kind of a separate action. And once that decision is made, it's one of the few instances where a planning commission, that's the only instance I know where they have the authority to make kind of a land use decision. Now that can be appealed to the board of supervisors, and sometimes it is. And then the board of supervisors could, change that decision. So within all of that context, I think what we've seen, and I know that there was a Department of Energy report that was a couple of years ago that looked at all the applications across the state and what they were seeing. And, I know Aaron Berryhill on your staff, Director Davis, worked with UVA compiling a lot of that information. And I want to say that all the applications that went fully through the process, it was roughly about 80 to 82% did get approval. Now that's with the caveat, some of them pulled out of the process at a certain point. In terms of I think where, VACO is in both assisting our members and advocating on their behalf, we quickly saw that there was not only the impacts to land use, but there was impacts to revenue. And I won't go into the whole story of it. Greg and I know that story pretty well, but it goes back to a 2014 law that gave a tax exemption on the machinery and tool for utility scale solar. It morphed over the years, but I think where we are now, and I'll bring in this other piece of it, I think it was the 2020 session, there was a host siding agreement law that really kind of changed the calculus for localities that made up for that lost revenue under machinery and tool tax, the mandated state exemption. So that piece I think is working very well. And I should also state that the host siding agreement goes beyond just the revenue aspects, it also gives the locality a chance to sit with the developers and sit with their community and constituents and say, what are things that need to be addressed within our community for these impacts? You know, I'll give you an example of one where I think localities are now starting to figure this out because it was just an unintended consequence. But there was one county that bordered another county where a huge installation went in. And as part of that process of bringing in all the steel and the glass and everything for that, they would come on the county secondary roads in the one county to access into this county. Well, a lot of county secondary roads weren't ready for that traffic, the heavy trucks, and it tore up those roads. And so some of the things that a county can do is like, they can get a traffic analysis, like how many truck trips are going to be on these roads? And they can consult VDOT and determine how do we, make up for the damage to those roads that could be a fund that could help replace and rebuild those roads. That's just one example. I mean, there's many others that when you think about these, stormwater is a big issue. That's one that hopefully can be addressed through a siding agreement. So you have that, I think, piece moving forward. In terms of educating the members, we held a forum back in 2018 in Dinwiddie County. And we had a lot of different counties and engineers and others give presentations to our members to talk about how they have reviewed, permitted, and established utility scale solar within their jurisdictions. And I think that was really helpful for a lot of our members. I think moving forward, obviously, some of the projects are even getting bigger. There's the 500 megawatt project, which had been the biggest project to date in Western Spotsylvania, but there's an 800 megawatt project that got approved in Charlotte County, which now we're going to see, maybe even some bigger ones. We're definitely being keyed into the process by which DEQ is going to update their PBR regs to permit by rule regs for legislation from a couple years ago called House Bill 206. We're also starting to see energy storage and energy storage not even necessarily associated with a utility scale solar. It can be anywhere in the county because it has value as part of the grid system. One of the things that we're really thankful for was the General Assembly not only stepping up in terms of some of the legislation I've talked about, but also giving resources for what's known as the Virginia Energy Land Navigator, or VALN. Is anybody here familiar with that? So a couple years ago, and it was actually under legislation called Small Modular Reactor. So you wouldn't think it had anything to do with this, but in the enactment clauses, it gave money and directed Virginia Tech and their geospatial information GIS group to work on creating an active GIS layers where a county or others can go on and say, okay, where are the forested lands? Where are the prime agricultural lands? Where are the transmission lines going through a county? And so I think that's a great resource. Other examples I'll give of counties really delving into this issue. We had one member that decided to consult directly with the incumbent utility and say, hey, where is the transmission capacity in our community? Where do you kind of see that there's capacity in our community that would accommodate utility scale solar? And so I think that's some of the innovative ways that our members are starting to look at these proactively at the land use changes that they're seeing in regards to this, what's a relatively new use. Now with that, I didn't bring any slides or anything. I think y'all are pretty familiar with the topics and the issues, but any questions you may have, engage in conversation.
Yeah, I just a question, because I think associations typically have varied interests depending on their members, and if you're representing the counties in the Commonwealth, can you talk a little bit about, do you see differences in terms of those counties who are supportive of utility scale, the larger scale solar projects?
Mhm.
Are those typically the localities where those projects are located, or do you see like a difference? Are they located elsewhere? Can you just talk about maybe some of the geographic or the regional dynamics and how that plays into your members' what you hear from your members and for feedback?
Yeah, I think when we first started to see the utility scale solar, it was locating a lot in Southern Virginia or Eastern Virginia. Particularly on agricultural, zone, but agriculturally used lands typically, very flat, drains well, it makes it easier for development. And, I think another component of that is land that was probably leased for farming, but not owned and operated for farming. And so what you would see is, families for generations had land that, was under, agriculture, or they would lease it to a farmer. And then they would get an opportunity. And I understand it definitely, from a financial standpoint, to lease their land now for solar and probably get a lot more money annually for that. I think in terms of where we've seen it go since then, we've now seen it expand to larger forested tracts in a lot of areas. So you're seeing a lot more conversion there. You're even seeing what you wouldn't think would be, from a kind of a geography type situation, but places like Pulaski, which are relatively mountainous, you're starting to see applications there. I think with county, maybe some applications. So you're starting to see some interest in other areas of the state. I think also, part of what we see too is, I think in Northern Virginia, where land prices are a lot more. We started to see a couple of projects maybe in Prince William, but I think there's maybe one or two. But now a lot of land up there is very expensive and becoming more expensive because it's very desirable for cloud computing centers. So you're starting to see that in those areas. In terms of, I think our membership, and I think this is a good point, our members across the board, whether you're in Arlington or Halifax County, they kind of all support each other in kind of the land use decisions. So in other words, in Arlington County, which would like to source a lot of its energy from renewable sources, they would also like, the counties where it's coming from to make the best choices for their constituents. Did that answer your question?
Thank you.
Joe, has VACO made policy recommendations to individual counties as they're looking to craft their own solar ordinance or energy ordinance? Is there a set of standards or recommendations that VACO provides counties?
There's not a set of standards or recommendations. And part of that really goes to the fact that each individual county is different, but not only that, each individual application is different. And I'll give you an example I talked with Joanne about before we got started. There was one county where I talked to the county administrator, and there was a 150 megawatt project that their county board approved, and it was recommended for approval by staff and by planning commission. I think it was unanimous. And it was in an area of the county where it made sense. He said it had transmission capacity. The land was fallow. It hadn't been used for agriculture actively. So it seemed like a great changeover in the use, and they, addressed all the impacts. Similarly, in that county, there was a developer that came forward and, and what I think, a lot of smart developers will go and talk to county staff or county administrator before really making a decision to apply. They say, hey, look, we're interested in putting a 20 megawatt facility right next to the entrance to the state park there. You're like, all right, hold on, wait a second. This is a big resource in our county, scenic resource. We don't think that would be the best fit there. And so there really is not kind of one set of standard kind of recommendations or policies that, we would suggest. What we do offer though is as much information as we can, and we encourage our members to learn more about it. And to work with applicants, work with the community in learning more. And I will say too that, there's also state resources. Department of Energy has been providing a lot of resources to our members and coming out on request. I'll come out, sometimes at the request of boards and planning commissions. I remember one county in particular, I had a request to come, and it was just me for 3 hours back and forth with the planning commission. And I must have done too good a job because they asked me back for the board. for another 3-hour session. And the funny thing is, it was a great conversation because it went by quickly. It wasn't boring and I didn't have any slides or anything. It was just, learning from them also what was important to them, right? Which kind of helps us sometimes in terms of our policy at the General Assembly.
Before you go, Greg, we do actually have an in-person quorum. So in order to allow, is it just Harry joining remotely?
Paul also.
Harry and Paul to,
And Mike Well.
and Mike to participate virtually, entertain a motion to allow them to do so.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Any opposed? All right, so the members joining remotely can participate, ask questions. Greg?
So Joe, let me ask you the impossible answer for an existential question that we're all dealing with now. So, we have a Virginia Clean Energy Plan that really highlights a transition toward renewable energy. We have utilities that now have mandatory RPS obligations where they have to hit certain renewable energy obligations. We have landowners who want to develop their land in a particular way. We have obviously a whole industry that's not developed around renewable energy, broadly speaking. And yet, as of today, the ultimate land use decision, the approval process for any project is vested with the locality, as it is for almost all other land use decisions. Not all, but almost every other land use decision. So what do we do? I mean, forget about HB 206 for a second and everything we're going through there, but we have a system where the state says these targets must be hit. This is our goal. This is what we want to do. Utilities, you have to transition in, start procuring renewables, but the power to decide yes or no is delegated to however many hundred and whatever localities we have in Virginia. And as you know, there has been a movement towards more restrictive, at least on a case-by-case basis, decision-making at the local level, to the point where we could run into, it becomes impossible to develop a project at the same time the state is mandating projects be developed or directing projects be developed. We did.
I think that's a great question, Greg, and I would even take it a step even higher in terms of the energy landscape in Virginia. And we had a great session on this at our annual conference. And even beyond the Virginia Clean Economy Act, even beyond the RPS standards, even beyond all the federal and state tax incentives, there's a huge demand for energy production in Virginia. And I mentioned cloud computing earlier. Cloud computing is really now taking forefront in a lot of our communities in terms of land use impacts, transmission lines, changing over. I mean, there was a case where there was a residential, approved residential development in one of our Northern Virginia localities, ready to go. But it was so much more valuable for cloud computing that the developer got enough money to turn that over after all the soft costs and engineering costs to get that approval. So I say that as context is, I think, even beyond all that, and a lot of the cloud computing, if we're going to accommodate that while reaching zero greenhouse gas emission production is going to be really difficult. So even beyond, this, I think 16,100 megawatts in the, Virginia Clean Economy Act. And I don't know what the most recent IRP for Dominion is in terms of what they predict would be needed in terms of solar. It's huge, right? And, I can say, too, that our members want to retain that authority to make those land use decisions on a case-by-case basis. They're still out there and available to work with on making the best decisions. There's going to become a point, though, I think, where there might not be enough solar to meet the demand for energy. And another factor into it, and it kind of complicates things, is, where we are on energy storage capacity and technology. A few years ago, there was an SCC work group that I participated on with a lot of stakeholders that was, looking at the issue of energy storage. And could we use energy storage? So when the sun is shining brightly, the wind is blowing, and we have excess coming into the grid, we use that to store that energy and then bring it back to the grid when we need it, when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. And what we found is, and it was a consultant that SCC hired, and in other nations and other states where they looked at this, is when kind of a service territory or state or country got above 50% of their energy production from renewables, that the current energy storage technology could not make up that difference. Because I think it's about 4 hours they can be dispersed. And so I say all that to say is we could get to 2040, 2045 under the Virginia Clean Economy Act standards, and we may not meet 100% of renewable energy production because of that kind of mismatch. And so I kind of say that all into context is our members are really well aware of this. And so, you know, they want to make sure that even with all these mandates that they keep hearing about, that they're still making those best land use decisions in their cases. And, you know, some of the concerns are too, you know, I've seen some of the projections that to meet maybe the Virginia Clean Economy Act, we would only need to convert maybe 1% of land in Virginia to solar. I've seen some of these numbers, but it really comes down to a case by case basis. If you're in a magisterial district, which is how counties are broken up, and you approve one 200 megawatt project and another 100 megawatt project, within that magisterial district, you're impacting a lot more than 1 to 2% of the land. And has an impact not only amongst the, you know, kind of the viewshed or what people expect, but it has kind of a ripple through some of the local economy. I mentioned earlier, you know, farmers that lease land, and they are part of that local agricultural economy. They hire workers, they buy feed, they buy grain, they buy fuel. And when land gets converted over to solar, that kind of local production is lost. And so that's some of the things that I think some of our members are looking at and grappling with, particularly in high production areas of agriculture. I don't know, that answer your question?
Well,
Yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying.
It's almost impossible, like, at some point, and one of our jobs as an authority, at least in theory, and I guess we'll talk about this some more later this morning, is to make recommendations for policy decisions to the administration and the General Assembly. And at some point, those two things can become mutually exclusive, where you say, the state says do this, but the locality gets to be the approval body. And that, I think we all know that's the rub we're running into in lots of places. Second question for you. I'm gonna be very specific. If you can't answer me, you can't answer. Has VACO taken a position as to whether or not it is legal for localities by ordinance to ban or limit a particular type of development within their jurisdiction?
What I would say is, under current state law, it's pretty clear in 15.2 that authority to regulate land use and what's, you know, the powers that are there. In terms of solar, the only thing it talks about is rooftop or ground mounted in residential, particularly residential, but residential, commercial, and even agricultural areas, that a locality has to permit it as a by right use if it's serving the load for that use, right? That's the only thing that I see limiting a locality's ability to determine to make land use decisions. Now, if it comes to saying in certain agricultural areas, like, I'll give you an example. One of our members had set a target saying, all right, they, for our county, we are willing to allow the conversion of X amount of acres of prime agricultural land to solar. That might be one thing that they can, that's just an example. And I think it's pretty clear that, you know, they feel comfortable making that decision. I haven't heard of any challenges to that on a case by case basis.
And so just to be clear, VACO's position that it would be legal, for example, for pick whatever jurisdiction to pass an ordinance that says we will not accept any applications for utility scale solar development in this jurisdiction.
Well, I don't think it's that cut and dry. I think what it is, Greg, is you look at your zoning ordinance, and within the body of the zoning ordinance in the various districts, you outline what are the permitted uses. And then you may, as an addendum to that, outline what are uses permitted through a special use permit process, which you still have to go to the board.
Joe, similar question, maybe a different angle. I absolutely agree and like what you said about preserving local control, as well as treating these projects on their merits, case by case basis. You cited the 80% figure from the Virginia Solar study a couple years ago. I think a few years ago, we saw more projects being considered on a case by case basis, but increasingly projects are not allowed to be considered on a case by case basis with counties. They will pass these ordinances or cleverly repeal ordinances, allowing no pathway forward for an application. How do we get past that? If the standard is to consider these projects on a case by case basis and projects cannot even apply, cannot get a meeting, a pre-app meeting with the county, cannot get even their first hearing. How do we square that?
Well, you know, I don't know the specific examples you're talking about, first off. But what I would say is, once again, going back to the zoning ordinance, it's the decision of that local governing body, what the zoning ordinance allows for in terms of uses. And solar is just one, or energy storage is just one. And so the answer to that question is, I think it's having a conversation, you know, with each individual board and, you know, making a case for, you know, we think this is a use that could be beneficial to the county. It's the people that live within that county, it's the planning commission. It all comes down to the community itself making, kind of those decisions on what they consider.
The position of VACO or your legal analysis would be that counties have the right to not allow solar storage development as a permitted use. Well, say Caroline County, for example, had a great solar ordinance and as a way to stop development, period, repealed it so that there's no pathway forward. They can't do that. Other counties could follow that model too.
Well, I don't know if it's about a county following model, but I'll go back to my answer to Greg earlier. The only limitation that we know of in relation to solar and land use authority is for rooftop mounted, ground mounted, serving the load of that use. On-site behind the meter, that's the only limit we know.
Common complaint I hear from the renewable developers is the difficulty of navigating 95 or 100 different county permitting processes and the complexity therein. Sometimes those counties are ideologically opposed to the development to begin with. But I hear other developers say, look, if that's the challenge, then we need to rise to the challenge and we need to do a better job persuading those who are opposed. To that end, are there more education forums being planned? I think you mentioned one in 2018. It's been 6 years. Is there more to come?
We continue to educate our members, you know, through our annual conferences. We'll have sessions on utility scale solar or energy storage, you know, and I mentioned it earlier too. We kind of do even the broader landscape of kind of the whole energy landscape at our last meeting, our annual conference, and Catherine was one of the presenters along with one of our members from Northern Virginia, and they talked about, you know, what are the energy needs in Virginia? Where is it going to come from? How do you, you know, address those impacts? So yeah, we're continuing to do that.
Are you noticing that as the education level goes up and people go up the learning curve, are you noticing a difference in their acceptance or objections to solar development, just as a general observation?
No, I mean, that's not an observation that we've necessarily made. I mean, we don't necessarily track, you know, each individual county. I mean, there's 95 of them, right? And there's a lot of applications out there. But that's not necessarily one we've seen one way or another.
One of the things I think we've experienced is for counties that have seen, if you're trying to look for correlations, one of the correlations was, I think as an observation, is the more proposed projects in a county or in neighboring or adjacent counties, we tend to see, I would say, a process that is a little different than maybe for the first project, in the sense that, to your point, how many acres or what percentage of that county may be under either already permitted or under consideration for solar, that tends to drive a lot of the conversations kind of in a different direction, like how much, you know, at what point do we say no? Do we close the gates? And what's the right balance? So we start to see those questions come in when you start to see 2, 3, 4, 5 large projects in a single locality, depending on the locality, the size of the locality, but that's just our observation.
No, I think that's, you know, fair observation. I mean, I think it goes back to just some of the things that, and this goes back to the conversation we had at our conference, is the demand for energy production in Virginia. In a lot of our counties, they see the change in the land going over in particularly in certain areas, ministerial districts. And to Catherine's point, they say, okay, how much more can we actually take on in terms of this land use conversion within our boundaries?
Joe, is there anything that you hear from counties that the industry or developers could improve on?
You know, I don't think I've heard anything in particular. I think I just go back to reiterating, you know, the sooner you can get in and have a conversation with, you know, county staff, learn about the comprehensive plans within that jurisdiction, learn about the process, get to know the people in the community, that's always a good thing.
If Vaco had a magic wand to fix the rubs that we're talking about and help make the development process easier for certainly your county constituencies, what would you do with that magic wand?
Well, good hypothetical question. I think what we're seeing is things that we are very appreciative of the state stepping up. I talked about the siding agreement. I think that's made a huge difference in giving localities the ability and the developers the ability to sit down and say, what is it that we want to achieve? I think also I mentioned the Virginia Land and Energy Navigator, even more resources along those lines are great. You know, the assistance that DOE gives our members is great. Those are all things that I think help our members be more informed for the decisions that they make.
So more state resources, more state guidance could be helpful too.
But I think what we've gotten so far has been great. Could there be more and more targeted? I think part of what we're going to see, and Greg and I served on this work group, the House Bill 206. You know, there's going to be some decisions made there on addressing impacts to agriculture and forestry for those projects that go through the permit by rule process. And as a part of that, I think the state's probably going to need to step up some resources in certain areas to help make those decisions. I don't know, Greg, if you would agree on that.
And I think AB 206 is a whole other set of problems and
Or opportunities.
yeah, I'm surprised that's an opportunity, but I mean, the state now essentially taking a land use interest in having state requirements based on impacts to local land that don't supplant the locality's rights to take an interest in that land, which is going to, I mean, I can't imagine any scenario where it makes a development easier. It may not affect the development, but in all likelihood, it's going to lead to the locality having certain demands and expectations for a project to get developed, and then the state having additional ones, and how those are going to interplay now.
Well, I think you raise a valid, I think, concern. I think part of maybe what the state can do is help to provide those resources and have those conversations between the state and the locality and with the developer. You know, a good example is, you know, when we sat down in the first, the larger work group that was even outside of the DEQ process, I was part of a smaller sub-work group, and actually we met here in this very library a couple of years ago. And one of the things that we discovered was, you know, the sooner you can come to a locality prior to even doing your notice of intent under the PBR, to have a discussion with that locality on, hey, here's the piece of land we're looking at. You know, what is it that we should know? And one of the examples is one of the members on that work group was representing a county, and the other was representing a developer that had worked in that county. And one of the things that they had discovered is like, look, we're really interested in this buffer along this road. Let's have that discussion up front before we even go through the application process. And I think some of that can happen with House Bill 206. I do see that there's opportunities, and particularly some of the resources that were provided for Virginia Tech from the subject matter experts, Dr. Lee Daniels, on how do you, when you go and look at a site, thinking about future land use, potentially when it's going to be forested or agriculture after the life of a solar operation, how do you work in a way to impact those soils the least amount so that it could be turned back over to agricultural production? I think those are some of the great resources that the state could help provide in some of those instances. And I think a lot of that can help address a lot of concerns for localities at the end of the life of a project when it comes to decommissioning or maybe returning the project back to a previous use.
Well, and there are better people in this room to speak to this than myself, because we have actual developers here in the room. But as you know, we represent, dozens of developers around the state. And the combination of projects being rejected at the local level, good projects, well-designed projects being rejected at the local level. Ordinances that either literally prevent an application from coming forward or send a message that sort of the county's not open for development. And then things like HB 206 and other things. What we're seeing more and more from our developer clients is just looking elsewhere outside of Virginia. And we're just seeing more and more who say the landscape of Virginia is so narrowing where I can have a viable project, especially if you're looking at far enough out in the future that HB 206 and whatever obligations come will apply to your project. Obviously, there's a universe of grandfather projects. I think the biggest problem we have right now are not the projects that we know that went forward and couldn't get approval. It's the projects that we'll never even know that someone contemplated because they just never came forward with the project. And when Catherine's obligations to procure renewable energy aren't going away, the demands on generation are spiking for all the reasons you talked about. And the pool of developable land is shrinking so rapidly. I think we have a real problem coming where the status quo of state mandate certain obligation, Dominion has to fulfill it, locality has to approve it. I don't see how it works long term. And so that's why you and I get to hang out so much and have so much fun together.
Yeah.
That wasn't a question, but it was just a statement.
Yeah, no, I think a reaction. I mean, I think, that it is part of the larger energy landscape, and Kathy can comment on this, but, my understanding of the Virginia Clean Economy Act is it's not just solar and wind. There's other options. There's for non-greenhouse gas emitting production, such as next generation nuclear. And that's a whole nother discussion. But there's also the provision, I think, in the law that says when we get to those cutoff dates, the incumbent utilities, if they need to meet demand and they can't get it all from non-greenhouse gas emitting, production, they can apply to the SCC at that point and say, hey, look, we have to provide safe and reliable service.
There's an enactment clause in the Virginia Clean Economy Act that basically says nothing here shall preclude the ability to provide reliable and secure paraphrasing electricity to Virginia's customers. So it doesn't explicitly say.
Yeah.
If for land constraint reasons, you can't meet it through solar, you can do these things. But at the end of the day, we've got an obligation to keep the lights on 24/7, 365. So to your point, we're harnessing the power of the wind, we're harnessing the power of the sun. You mentioned 4-hour storage, which is customary or to more traditional, but we're also piloting some of the longer duration discharge batteries. One of them is slated to hopefully provide a discharge that could be as long as 100 hours over a longer period of time. But again, that technology sort of is being deployed and piloted on a smaller scale. And our planning horizons are, when we file our integrated resource plan, they're looking 15 to 25 years out. And the other issue we're facing is just the longer lead time on permitting. construction and supply chain in general is increasing the amount of time it takes any of us to get any types of projects permitted and online. So predicting our customers' energy needs in the future, harnessing technology that's proven is really critical. Integrating things like small modular reactors will be critical going forward as well. But, yeah, I mean, it doesn't explicitly say,
Doesn't explicitly say it, but yeah.
but at the end of the day, it doesn't change our obligation.
And I think another thing too, that I sometimes think about is we're not in isolated island, we're part of a larger grid. And, where's energy coming from the larger grid? And I think that's some of your IRP is that you're gonna have to get potentially energy generation from outside of Virginia to meet those demands.
We do on a very regular basis, but part of that, we are connected to PJM.
Yeah.
And each year, through the State Corporation Commission, the school proceeding, we have to demonstrate that we have at all times selected the resources that are in the best economic interest of our customers, as well as meeting those clean energy goals. So we have to prove that, and it also, in that sense, we are then beholden to the policy decisions in other states
Yeah.
that may be either constructing or retiring those resources. Over 98% of the resources that have been retired in the region are dispatchable resources, and more than 80% of roughly 80% of those that are proposed for new construction are non-dispatchable or don't have accompanying energy storage with them. So again, when customers' energy needs are growing, there's certainly that gap that we're working to address.
Scott, your hand up, stand up.
Oh, Harry, please. Sorry, when was that gonna?
Good, Harry.
No, thanks for the opportunity. Can folks hear me?
Yes.
Great. Joe, and I may have missed this, my internet failed there near the bottom of the hour. Interested for you to opine for a minute on the degree to which you are hearing questions and concerns around the siting for standalone storage in your counties, separating that out from this solar question. You may well have spoken to that. I may just have missed it, but going back to that, I think it's a slightly different issue.
Harry, that's a great question. I think initially when standalone storage facilities were being applied for in counties, heard some concerns because this is something new. They were concerns about things that they had read or seen about. I forget what the effect is, or when one of these might catch fire, and it burns out. But I recently have not heard many concerns about all of that. You all particularly might have more expertise on that, but from what I can tell, some of the initial kind of runaway fires that have happened in some of these facilities, I think have been addressed with maybe on-site monitoring, remotely that could help address those. So I haven't heard too many concerns from our members recently about that. Does that answer your question, Harry?
It does. And just a quick follow-up on that one, because so much of this question is sort of about the anchorage and land use issue fundamentally. Have you heard concerns about land use? I would anticipate not, given the footprint, but you may say otherwise.
Yeah, no, I haven't necessarily heard about concerns about land use. It is interesting. I mentioned that at least for utility scale solar, it seems to be, locating particularly in rural areas and outside of Northern Virginia. But I think I know of one project up in the Northern Virginia locality where it's maybe 100 megawatt storage facility, basically in a building with multiple stories that kind of fits in with the landscape. So that's kind of a different kind of use there.
Yeah, this is kind of a general question. Skylar, Greg, you guys might have an opinion on it, but do we know kind of the extent to which local kind of political opposition is creating a constraint that's preventing kind of the development of these resources to achieve the objectives of the BCA, the State Energy Plan, et cetera? Because it feels like there's a need to quantify that. And if you can quantify that, and it says there's just not enough development potential left in the state to achieve the objectives that were set out, a few years ago, then there's probably a need to address that through policy or otherwise. So I don't know if there's a good way to do that, but certainly looking at, the counties across the state and figuring out, where folks feel like they can do business and where they feel like they can't would be a start.
Yeah, I'm not sure how, I think it'd be great to be able to quantify, I'm not sure how you quantify it, because there's so many factors at play and the project being viable. It's not just the literal land. They mentioned like, there might be land available in Arlington County that somebody wants, would love that solar panel, but you could never do a project there. Our firm is actually compiling has compiled a list of localities, for example, that we think have ordinances that either act as moratoriums explicitly, caps explicitly, or sort of implicit development barriers that are embedded in their local ordinances. And this, again, how do you model that? I don't know. The problem is it's happening in the places where people want to take solar, which is why it's happening there. So for the history of solar development in Virginia, localities have largely been introduced to solar on a project basis, not on like a broad conversation basis. And so localities react to, so someone says, this is a great jurisdiction for solar, let's go do a project. We're first here. Counties aren't making any money because those first projects are tax exempt. Maybe some of the design components weren't as desirable as they are now. County reacts negatively, says, we're going to take a step by ordinance. And what should be a great county for development then becomes sort of hostile to it. I don't know how to quantify it. We're sort of working on trying to visualize it, by saying these counties, these counties, these counties. And I think Joe and I would disagree as to the extent localities have the authority to pass some of those moratoriums and caps and other things, and whether or not that therefore needs to be clarified.
That's just a question, and I wonder, like, I'm not advocating for this, it's really just a question as to whether or not the conversation has taken place. So if we're talking about the percentage of like land use within a county, is there any contemplation that after a certain amount of land is sort of used or set aside for those purposes, that you would have like, incentives for the county in the form of relieving some of those tax? Just like, are there any incentives for the counties to continue to approve projects?
Yeah, I mean.
Through in the form of like, those tax exemptions applying to projects that are, early in the county, but if a county's got 5 to 10 or more % of their land already set aside to solar.
Yeah.
What I guess my question is like, what incentivizes the county to continue to approve
That was
projects?
supposed to be decided in legislation, and that has been the way these projects have been brought forward. But a lot of counties say, no, we hit a threshold, we don't want to do it. And the problem is, again, I hesitate to speak for the developers, but I'll speak to the developers for a minute. The problem that they're running into is, it's not that they get to the county, they go through the full political process, they go to the public, they present their proposal, and then they're denied through the ordinary application of local land use authority. They're told, we've already hit our threshold, we're not accepting your application. And that's the part that is, we'll never know how many projects therefore don't ever even come forward because of that. But I mean, the idea is the siting agreement, Joe, may be a different thought on that. The siting agreement legislation was supposed to create incentive for localities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And I think it created an incentive for both the localities and the developers to work together.
Can I ask a naive question? Is the reasoning behind counties passing ordinances or revoking ordinances that prevent the development of solar based on the fact that they're concerned about the transition of land use from agriculture to solar? There's concern about the way it looks, or is it economic, that they're actually losing a tax base because they somehow get more tax revenue through the use of land for agriculture than they do for solar?
Yeah, I don't think that there's kind of one answer to any of that. It once again goes to each individual locality, looking at, their land use plans, competing land use, land uses, for that land, and then making those decisions. So I think some of those may be part of that. But it really, once again, it comes up to individual locality. I mean, I know one locality that thought about it in terms of, okay, they went to the income utility and said, what's our demand load on an annual basis for this locality? Like, how much energy do we need to serve, to serve our, from megawatt capacity basis? And I said, okay, and with the caveat that it wasn't a hard and fast cap, that they could always revisit it. They put in their comprehensive plan. At this point, we're willing to accept X amount of megawatts or acres to help meet our list.
Do they do the same thing for, this is how much food we need as a county, and this is the amount of agricultural land we need to supply that food?
I would say no.
They're not just-
Because they're, yeah, I mean,
It's
it's,
interesting, it's
well-
interesting like parallel then, right?
well, I
Because
think it's.
why would you make that, you're sending electricity to different places than you're
It,
getting
it
revenue.
depends on what your export economy is. And I think in the case of solar, at least for now, they've said, we don't necessarily want this to be our major export economy. Currently, their major export economy in this one county is agriculture. And they're very want to preserve that.
So it is an interest in preserving the current use of the land,
Yeah, which is zoned for that,
which is, sorry,
zoned for that agriculture.
it's yeah.
Do you think their interest would change if the economics were more attractive to bring on more solar? Just hypothetically.
I couldn't speak necessarily for the county, but I think part of what they're thinking about is their whole economy and their workforce and their production is currently within that agricultural realm.
Are you saying like not just the land, but if there's like production facilities that
Yes.
refine something or what have you,
Yeah.
like that is
Yeah.
associated with it, there's other jobs associated, not just,
Yeah. It's a value added product.
like it's grain, for example,
Yeah.
they have a granary or a mill or whatever. I don't know. Got it.
Meat processing.
Oh, gotcha.
I'd like to comment on that. I've gone to a number of meetings as far as solar in rural counties. And I do find it interesting that I see a lot of just this death, we're all gonna die, we're gonna be sick, just almost ridiculous comments were made. But they get people stirred up. I mean, they had flyers sent out to people about where these developers, landowners were gonna live, and sent pictures of our home. It was been very, very invasive. But I think for some reason, I think it's also maybe some jealousy, which maybe sounds silly to some of you, but just, there's this, these people can do this, we can't do this. It's, and all the talk about getting sick and dying and people had cancer because of it, there's no solar to me. It's been really ridiculous. In Nottoway County, they've had a couple of ordinances that have been torn up, they haven't passed them. I don't have a project there. We have a project been cited, but I'm not even considering it now. There's no ordinance that's been passed there. Their county is really in pretty dire needs financially. They need the income. But the people, it becomes these people that are protesting, I've been to in several counties, it becomes an emotional situation. And maybe it's just a lack of education. Maybe it's just a lack of, a new thing, but they're very personal about this. They attack you personally. I mean, it's been, have people signing, having signs put up all over the county, put it in the newspaper about this. It's very personal. And how do you get past those kind of issues?
You're asking me?
Well, I'm saying it's because, I've seen it in more than one county.
Yeah.
That's why I asked my question earlier about education.
Well, we've had people, I would say, in one of our projects, the first developer, and early on, it took a year and a half to get it passed. That the developer he was not prepared. He was not prepared. The contact was very poorly prepared. But people came from all over, people from other counties even came to me for this conversation. They were people who own land that lived that other county. They was just, they did all this research about how the fires, it went on and on. There's a multitude of reasons why it was awful. So I'm just asking, for maybe some comments on that. How do you bridge that thing? I think education is important, but some people don't want to hear the education. Or don't want to believe it.
Joanne, to make it even more difficult, if folks are relying on misinformation, showing up to a county meeting with their pitchforks. Supervisors are often in a very difficult position where they don't want to politically deny what is obviously nonsense, but have to take these votes and are incentivized to get reelected.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I would say that at least in Amelia, I think everybody there believes in private property rights. Most people in rural areas do believe they value their properties very much. But I would say that when it comes to solar, that's maybe an exception.
Yeah. to put a point in, what Robert and Colleen raised, economically, that the larger farm economy or ag economy that Joe's talking about is brought up very, very frequently, but on a dollar per acre basis, solar's paying 10 or 20 times more tax revenue than an ag operation might. The only thing that can beat that would be a warehouse or a data center in terms of taxes per acre, taxes per square foot.
And frequently, that the placement of solar on existing agricultural land allows the agricultural activities to continue on land that otherwise would turn into residential development or something else. We've seen that a lot with the shared solar projects that we're working on a lot now. They're oftentimes pop right in the middle of someone's farm. And that tax revenue or that revenue allows the farm to exist.
One thing I will observe that I think though is, you mentioned residential, I think in a lot of these areas, there's not a demand for residential going on that same property, so.
Is there any comment about prime farmland? This has been brought up at meetings, and I do think, I understand now about prime farmland. And I can see that, the exclusion of that, absolutely. But is that really well understood, what prime farmland is?
I think for a lot of our members, yes, it is, and they work a lot with Virginia Cooperative Extension. I mentioned earlier, Virginia Land and Energy Navigator, that's another resource where you can map these out on a county level and put these things into your plan.
Joe, I want to be respectful of your time. I have one last question for you, and if anybody has any more burning questions, cue them up in your mind now. Joe, some supervisors have taken me aside and said that they really don't like to consider this issue. They're solar fatigued, they're tired of it. Some have compared it to the cell tower issue, which predates me, but it used to be a very controversial topic at the local level where folks were relying on misinformation and acting viscerally against cell towers that we now see everywhere and recognize their importance. And that power was redistributed away from localities with the support of a lot of these localities. Don't want to be deciding these controversial topics at every monthly Board of Supervisors meeting. Some supervisors have said that quietly. I don't want to deal with this anymore. Let it be somebody else's problem. I get it, but I'm not going to make a tough vote that's going to cost me my reelection on a solar project. Have you all heard that behind closed doors from supervisors? Other county
Have
leaders?
not heard that sentiment at all. I mean, you do bring up the interesting about the cell towers. And I was a young planner back in the 90s working in a rural suburban locality, and I remember those battles. One thing to note, though, is localities still have the authority to make decisions over towers above 50 feet in height. So they still retain that, and our members still want to keep that. And I think it's the same thing for solar.
Excellent. Any closing thoughts, questions for Mr. Lurch? Well, Joe, thank you.
Thank you.
We've invited many folks from different counties, supervisor, planning, staff level, and all of them pointed us towards you. So very nice to have you join us today, answering our several questions and plotting the path forward. So really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you all. So nice to meet some of you for the first time, and some of you I've known for a while, and keep the conversation going.
Thank you, Joe.
And Greg, I'll see you probably in a couple of days.
In a couple of minutes.
Well, moving
Can
on
we
down.
just take a quick break? My laptop's about to run out of juice on this thing is not working, so I'll switch over here. Yeah, otherwise we'll lose the meeting.
I just think seats.
You can get it out plug.
Reach that far.
There's 4 ports in the floor there.
Then Josh. All right, let's keep this show on the road.
That was also in NEI.
All right, folks, we will continue on. I know some folks need to head out for different meetings around noon.
Oh, yeah.
It's really interesting, so far, it's so fun.
Sorry for, it's really slow.
I'm retired. I do get some offers and I think it's always pretty much.
All right, folks, let's go ahead and move forward with the consideration of the minutes from the October meeting. And then we'll get into the discussion of our 2023 report. I saw one highlight at the end. I believe that was, my right-hand woman, Ms. Webb, who had seconded the motion
Thank you.
at the adjournment last meeting. Are there any edits or suggested changes to these minutes from October 4th? I'd entertain a motion to approve them. If not, excellent. Moved and seconded. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed? All right, minutes are approved. Folks should have received a couple of copies of the 2023 report. Apologies for the radio silence on our end, having not gotten final approval to post these, our 2023 report. Let me do my best to summarize, and then Ken, our
I've got
director,
hard
Davis.
copies if anyone wants. I just ran out of time to enter them.
Gotcha. Are those the red line versions?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be really helpful, Ken. And while you pass those out, let me just say, we did what we thought was the impossible and got this report to the Energy Department and to the administration on time this year in the abbreviated version that the department asked for. Submitted this to the governor's policy office, or it made its way up to the governor's policy office and was returned to us with a multitude of edits. Many of the recommendations were taken out, and many of the more summarizing aspects of our past meetings in 2023 were changed. I did not feel comfortable as chair to accept these changes without bringing it back to the authority. And of course, the authority voted unanimously to approve these at our October 4th meeting, which was the result of a very deliberative session. So wanted to bring this back up for everyone's discussion and consideration today. After a conversation, our point of contact at the Attorney General's office, who helps us answer these questions as they arise. Spoke to him yesterday and has not gotten back with a formal answer on if we can submit our report to the governor and to the leaders in the assembly with or without the governor's policy office's approval. So I'd like to open it up as a discussion here. Director Davis, is there anything I'm missing or any more color that you would add?
Yeah, I mean, if I can maybe just give a little bit of an overview, and first, administration is very appreciative of this body and the deliberate work it does. I guess to mention the first note on there, it's been practiced, and I was talking to Al yesterday, it's been practiced as far back as at least Tim Kaine, that authorities and commissions, the reports that come out of them go up through the administration for review by the governor's policy office, whoever that governor happens to be. And then it's gonna be made, and then it comes back down. This authority is under the Department of Energy, which is an executive branch. It's at the executive branch, which then means that all the work we do goes up, gets reviewed, and then comes back down. So the administration this way that has to look at these to help make recommendations to it. The Attorney General's office, I think the reason why I may not have gotten called, as far as my understanding from a conversation I had last month, with them, formal opinions are taking 3 to 6 months at this point. Obviously they get backlogged. A lot of legislators ask about formal opinions all the time. The concern about this report, there's just a couple concerns that policy tried to edit in here. The first is that we want the reports as much as possible to be limited in scope and not just, in some cases, a regurgitation of the minutes. A lot of parts in here are very detailed. They're in prior minutes. The purpose of this hopefully is to make sure that they get to the appropriate parties in the General Assembly who then read them and are able to pull from them very quickly what they need to pull. And kind of limit that in scope. Secondly, we want to appear that we're not picking winners and losers, to as much as possible, not isolate this to companies, rather to products, initiatives, technology, but not isolated to promote a company or to disparage a different company. We want to make sure that when it comes to recommendations, that all sides are being heard before recommendation. I can tell you, so having the General Assembly experience, I can tell you how these reports are being, how they get used. In many cases, legislation is drafted from a report. That legislation, one of 2,500 pieces of legislation over 60 days that the legislature will consider comes in front of the committee. Someone will stand up and say that this legislation was recommended by X commission. That comes with a lot of perception. The first perception that things were vetted out, in other words, all sides are being heard. The governor, not based on whether the governor agrees or disagrees. I think any conversations that you all have had with policy, you know, that it's a very open-minded position that the administration has on a lot of things that are being discussed here. But we want to make sure that if a recommendation comes out, that it's truly been vetted by both sides. For example, and here are some recommendations about local governance. Obviously, a big concern for everyone on this commission, as well as policy, as well as other legislators. However, prior to the recommendations being made, there was not a chance for local government to be able to come and present their side. And the recommendations out of this body, as well as other bodies, carry sometimes significant weight on legislation introduced in the General Assembly. And so we want to make sure that there's a time and a chance for all of that discussion to be had before making that recommendation. Additionally, when a couple of things, I know that this was done in a manner to get this in front of us very quickly, and I appreciate that. Obviously, there's deadlines, and we like to make things as quick as possible. I understand in some of the minutes that it was mentioned about 24 hours that it just came out in front of. And some members had raised a concern that they hadn't had that long to look over it. And we want to make sure that everyone and the people around this position, some of them, they're not individuals that are members, but their companies are members. And so we want to make sure that when it's that when we look at a vote or we look at a body that we assume that it's been deliberative, that everyone has had time to have that conversation within their within the respective bodies, respective organizations. So that's kind of a number of reasons that we really kind of wanted to go back through, edit some of this to make it a little bit more concise and also still kind of hold the structure. And I think a lot of the large concepts that this body had put forward. And I think that's what policies edits have done.
Thank you, Director. What do folks want to do? It's,
Can I ask a statutory question?
Yes.
It's like, I guess I don't understand our obligation to accept these edits.
That's my question too.
Because you kind of gutted all the recommendations. So.
I don't see it in our enabling legislation to accept the edits.
So the standard practice and tradition has been that it has reports come out here. I think it's been referenced in your October minutes that it references that the reports will be submitted internally, then externally by review. And then once external, then it goes public after approved externally by the administration. So do you have to all vote to accept this? That may not be the case. However, the position of the administration and tradition has been that the administration policy team does work in collaboration for something before it is released.
appreciate that. And that's the exact question.
This red line is what the administration policy team has suggested. And it addresses a lot of the concepts that I mentioned a few minutes ago.
This is the exact question that we put to the Attorney General's office. Based on the conversation with our rep, Mr. Lansing, yesterday, he did not expect for it to take a few months. He said that he could have an answer very quickly, but the point person on it was out of town this week. So they plan to just to weigh in here, and based on my conversation with the policy office, they were completely fine with his recommendation to get some clarity from the Attorney General on what this enabling legislation does and where that final call lies. I do want to say that our report draft was very deliberative. We spent at least 2 meetings going over it and had forums at both of those meetings to do so. And I will say also that, the authority is unique in that companies are not represented here. These are individuals. So if you leave your job, your seat on this authority remains.
I can respect that, except that I would say that the majority of people here are here because of their position in the company and the expertise they have inside that company. Additionally, I would not expect that anyone sitting in this body would act contrary to the entity they presently work for. So.
Exactly. I completely agree. So when folks made the step forward to vote in the affirmative to pass this, I think that they did so in the understanding that they perhaps had the blessing of the organizations that they represent. I welcome the other folks' thoughts, but I might entertain a couple of different options. We could vote to accept the changes of the policy office and submit this report, which give the Energy Department the ability to post it online. We could do nothing and wait and see what the Attorney General's office says and follow that recommendation when it's made. Those are 2 potential steps forward. I'm open to any other thoughts from others.
I guess another question I have is that on our enabling legislation, in addition to sharing the report with the governor, it says the chairman of the House Committee on Appropriations, the Senate Committee on Finance and Appropriations, the House Committee on Labor and Commerce, and the Senate Committee on Commerce and Labor. And so what I'm wondering is, should we also share it with those? Have we already? Have we traditionally?
They're addressed here on the.
But have they seen it?
No. And traditionally, they do not see it until it's gone up the chain through the administration. It's been standard practice and tradition.
So it's possibly another option to send our agreed upon report to them as well.
Maybe a third option. I mean, I truly don't want to be antagonistic here. I just proud of the work that the authority put together. I think these could be very helpful recommendations. And honestly, I don't, from a legislative perspective, you may find it differently, but I don't see, that this report as it currently stands would necessarily come across as endorsed by the governor's office, because there are appointees here from Democrats, Republicans, speakers, leaders in the Senate, different governors. So
having sat in the legislature, I can say that there's this assumption, and we all know that there are different administrations that have appointed people in this body. And maybe a lot of the more senior members recognize that when they're sitting in commissions. Typically, it's assumed that when a board or commission endorses something, that is that governor's board or commission, because that governor appoints its members. Now, we all know that there's turnover differences. That's not, especially some of the newer members. That's not the thought. I know, and Greg from this as well, but from time to time, you'll get a representative or lobbyist who will come forward with the commission as endorsed, and the perception that it's been endorsed by that governor's administration, which is not the case. So sometimes there's a little bit of a misunderstanding. And I think that is maybe why tradition has been to send this up through the administration. One other option, I know, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned too, third may be more of a kind of a discussion, quick discussion at the appropriate time. A couple of people went off to discuss the items of which ones you may have concern with. I think we discussed that there are some that make sense. We don't want to call out entities and disparage entities. We don't want to make broad sweeping assumptions. I know here, Virginians expect, or what was it? Something about Virginians want, and you don't want to make those broad sweeping assumptions in there, right? When we talk about locality barriers, we know that there may be some localities but we don't want it to, the statements to feel that it encompasses all localities. But at the same time, you'd hate to put out something that says this locality is not a good actor. And so it's those types of things that at the detail level maybe don't belong in here, but at the 30,000 foot view, we recognize that this is a challenge and may need to be addressed. Is that type of wording that I think the policy team is looking for, as opposed to more the detail level that calls out certain entities?
And I'm very amenable to that. So a couple of the points that were raised originally would be removing the name of Energy Department staff who make presentations. Totally makes sense. Removing the names of counties and specific examples totally makes sense. But it also goes a step further and takes away the recommendations that the authority made that were, brought to light by some of these different presentations. So, in terms of changing the grammar, changing, those references, completely on board.
There have been other reports issued by various agencies that hold forward recommendations, not of the authority, not representing the administration, but you could say, something like presenters recommended, or certain presenters recommended the following. I don't know if that would be acceptable or not, but what I hear you saying is that there are recommendations that aren't reflected that were made, and they may or may not have the concurrence of everybody here or the administration. If it's and those you're saying are in the minutes, right? But there've been others that have handled it as opposed, so remind me of the statutory obligation. Is the statutory obligation of the authority to issue a report or the department issue a report?
The authority just staffs.
So Gary had his hand up when we get a break for him.
Sure. I mean, so my thoughts kind of all over the place on this, and I'm sympathetic to the administration's interest in this document. I can't help but put my legislator hat on and just like read the code. Which the way I would read it would not necessarily be in line with what we've seen come back from the administration. So for example, we aren't a state agency. We're not an executive branch agency. We're not an executive branch authority. We're actually a political subdivision, which is by definition an independent body that is staffed by an executive branch agency or Department of Energy. We don't report to the governor. We report to the administration, the committees, the energy committees, the regulatory committees, the finance committees. I'm actually surprised that the administration has any actually cares in this document. To me, it exists to be in a stakeholder document to make recommendations, which any one of the recipients of that can put whatever weight behind it they would like to. And so that what I'm very sympathetic to is that there's been this course of history where it has been treated more like an administration document that's going to come forward with some kind of stamp from the administration. I do think it's different. So I was on the code commission for years. I'm sure when you're on housing commission or whichever one you were on, and code commission, housing commission, crime commission, those things are actually legislative commissions that come forward with actual bills. We're not going forward with bills. We're just making some recommendations conceptually. And so I think it's a little different than when someone stands up and says, this is a crime commission bill, for example. But I understand, especially when we have 100% of the General Assembly apparently turns over every year, that not everybody in the room sort of understands that nuance. And so just Greg speaking, I don't feel like we have an obligation to report back to the administration what the administration wants us to report back to them. I don't think that's our job. I do think we have to take into account the administration's feedback and for it to be as impactful as possible. And ultimately, if we want our recommendations to lead to something, we need all stakeholders, including the most important stakeholder, which is the administration, to have some buy-in to what we're recommending. I think process-wise, I actually think we went through a very healthy process here. I realized that some people didn't review the proposed final version long before the last meeting, but we actually went line by line through and edited. Remember, several people in here had some concerns. And that we tried to address. I think actually process-wise, we did a really good job. I think we've done what our statutory mandate is. I think the administration has made it clear that they agree, and I actually don't care about the summary portion of the document, that the stuff that says what we did. I don't care if the whole thing went away, other than the fact that we're statutorily supposed to do it. I don't care about that. If we just said, look at the minutes, as far as I'm concerned, that's enough for that portion. The real question to me is, do we make independent recommendations that care nothing about the administration? Do we make recommendations that care only about the administration? Or do we say, you know what, the administration is a stakeholder in this process. We've now gotten feedback from them. Let's reevaluate the recommendations and give them whatever way we choose to give them. I think legislatively, you would have every right to say thanks, but no thanks. But legislatively, we have that right. I'm not sure that's a good idea. I think the concern that I have at this point is we are required by a certain deadline by statute to have provided this, not just the administration, which we had our deadline, but we were required to give this to committee chairs in October, and we haven't done it. So we are in violation of our statutory mandate. And relitigating, redrafting this whole document is only going to put us further in violation of that statutory mandate, and is going to make it impossible for anything we do to be relevant in this general assembly session. And so whatever we do, I want to get it done in like the next 5 minutes. And I gotta go.
Did it.
Sorry to back up, but real quick, I'm new to the group and I was out of the room when we did introductions. Are you part?
I'm the director of the Department of Energy.
Okay, thank you.
So I guess what I hear you saying is there's a pending question before the Attorney General who is assigned to the group.
That's right.
What is the question that was posed to them? Could you remind us of that?
Very simply, I gave them the background, but very simply, it's, does the authority have the right to create its own reports? Or does the authority have the right to create reports only if they're approved by the governor's policy office? And that's what he's looking into.
I don't think that's a hard question to answer. Whether they can, the time, to me, it's not a question whether we have the authority to do an independent one. It's whether it's, to me, the government, the administration, is a very important stakeholder. How much weight do we give the administration's feedback in evaluating what is the appropriate
And I
recommendation?
want to say some of it is the credibility of commission, not just the commissioners look full. When a recommendation comes out, the perception is that both sides have been consulted and that both sides have been taken into account. I think a number of y'all have had conversations with myself or policy, that they are very open-minded to a number of ideas that many of y'all have talked about. But when a recommendation comes out, and I'll go back to local government, for example, of how do we solve a problem, but local government hasn't been there to opine until today. It kind of puts the cart before the horse on the recommendation. Either A, it calls into credibility the recommendation, or undermines it. And that's whereas the recommendation, if you expect the recommendation to put forward that both sides have been brought in front of the entity to share both their concerns, and then a recommendation comes forward, and that's kind of some of the concern I know as well.
I will say, Joe was invited to the meetings in September as well. Wasn't committed to come until today, but
Well, and I think Greg Davis raised an interesting point. Well, one, I don't view this as a both sides issue. I don't think there's we are one side and somebody else is some other side. I think there's a big group of stakeholders. The code actually anticipates those stakeholders. It directs that the membership may include representative solar businesses, solar customers, renewable energy financiers, state and local government solar customers, institutions of higher education that have experience in energy technology and solar research academics. It's not an exclusive list. It's a list of who may be on there. I think it's a valid policy question of should the enabling legislation make it clear local government should have a seat at this table. They're not prevented from doing so today, but they aren't. The General Assembly, I was gone, you voted on the bill, I was gone.
And I think there was a very clear reason why local government was not put on.
Yeah, I don't remember. I was
It
already.
was very deliberate.
Yeah, I was gone, but that's an interesting policy question. But as of today, they're not. And they're not by statute and they're not by appointment. And so all the people who could have appointed local government to this have chosen not to do so. Now, again, I'm not in the camp. I'm in the camp of we have the legal authority to disregard every recommendation from the governor's office. And I'm in the camp that that is a dumb thing to do. because it's not healthy for the authority, and it's not advancing the ball, and it's not acknowledging important stakeholders.
Let's try to reach some consensus here. I think we could all agree that removing names of department staff and specific counties is acceptable.
Did that exist in the, like, the summary of what we gave in section? That wasn't in the recommendations, was it?
Just some. And then is there consensus on whether we want to wait for the Attorney General opinion or approve the version with the edits? Is that your pleasure, Mr. Christopher?
There is a both option, perhaps. The authority recognizing some of the comments that Greg just made about whether or not the law allows it to go forward without going through the review of the policy office. How effective is that going to be compared to proving it as requested with the amendments or something close to that, so that the administration could embrace it? And then, regardless of the opinion, whichever way that goes, work with the Department of Energy as your liaison to policy. Our director, obviously, is tied in very closely to policy, on anything that's not in there that you still feel is an important policy goal that you want to get across.
In my discussion with policy, it's not necessarily that they disagree with some of these recommendations. It's not this year.
Or not the form.
I think it's probably not the form. I think it's probably the clarification. I mean, I'll give you an example. I think policy even left it on here, about the new position in the Department of Energy. I mean, I can tell we just restructured the Department of Energy. Although I will have someone that oversees storage, I do not have a position, nor desire to have someone who solely oversees that entity. They play into a much bigger role. I don't know if Al or Ken were asked about how we handle this, but to have the recommendation that Department of Energy does this without asking how does the Department of Energy expect to handle this type of scenario? And that's where I think it becomes vetting things out. I can tell you, having been a chairman for a couple of years on the committee, these reports are only used by one entity. You will never see a legislator get up and waive a commission or a committee or a report. You won't see a chairman do it. You'll see a lobbyist do it. That's why it's so important to have these right. When it says that the things have been vetted, they're being vetted. Chairman, so I probably got 30 reports the week before session started when I chaired education. I had to go through them quickly. I vetted out what I needed. They were great informational things, very crisp, to the point of many things, but they were never brought up by me or any of my members on my committee. They were only brought up by lobbyists to support what they wanted to push forward. And in many cases, that's very helpful. But the expectation is that the commission, the authority, has been able to truly vet out something amongst all the stakeholders that us as legislators have not the time to do, which is really why we have so many commissions and authorities, is to really take that deep dive into an issue that legislators can't do during the 6-day session with 2,500 bills. And they have a hard time doing it over the summer as well, because they all have jobs. And so that's why it's very important what y'all do, but it's also very important that there's a deep dive into it.
I'm sorry, I think all of us have you'd be good downtown too.
And Harry's had his hand up for quite a time now, so we'll hear his piece.
Yeah, I think we're gonna lose our point.
We lose our form because we've got to be downtown.
Before we lose our quorum, does anybody have a motion?
Okay, there's a couple of people online. We just take one or two online, but there's here.
Yeah, Harry.
Yeah, very quickly, hearing the concerns of Director Davis in regards to the perception of what the authority is. And I think Greg's comments and clarifying, in fact, the particular role that the authority plays, that is my perception, having been appointed from by the legislature and not the governor's office to this body, that it is a advisory body for all branches of government. And thus having one branch of government necessarily winnow that strikes me as difficult from a precedential standpoint. Should we then send should we send the original version of the report to chairs and have them vet it as well? I mean, this just seems problematic from a standpoint, but it might be helpful to include in the upfront language of this, just simple language that says, this is the, these are the recommendations, this is the report of the commission. It is not representative necessarily of the legislature or the governor's office in that regard, and thus to address that point about the perception issue that I think Director Davis has raised very reasonably. Is that a way that we can begin to cut through this knot?
Paul or Michael, do you have anything before we lose our quorum?
No, I agree with what Harry just said, and I also agree, what Greg said. So I'm on board that I do think we're a little bit broader, and I do have a concern with the edits that as posted. So just want to make sure that's registered.
So I'm just looking for some direction here from the authority before we lose Greg. Is there a motion to do anything or to not do anything? What are we to do?
If we take no action, where are we?
I think we're in the hands of the Attorney General.
If we take no action, we have a report that's been sent on to one of the recipients of it, are we gonna send it to the other ones or?
Just send it to the other ones with the caveat that this is the authority's opinions, not those of the governors and the other bodies that we report to.
Implementing that would probably require the department's approval of staff to send it, or would you send it to chair people?
We all work for somebody.
As of this moment, it would, until there is either policy comes out and request to be sent, or the OAG comes out, it won't be sent as is.
Man, I think we're in a stalemate, and we'll wait to see what the Office of the Attorney General says, and I think we have consensus that, we'll remove those staff names and county names that are problematic, and whatever, if we either accept the version that policy gave us, or if OAG says that we can create our own reports, we'll still do that, just have a respect and good precedent, and we'll see where things go, but at least the governor's office read this very thoughtfully, and I really appreciate your attendance at a couple of these meetings and going through our reports. That's half the battle, and I don't think all of this was in vain, so thank you.
I appreciate it from all of you.
Yeah. Thank you, Greg.
I know when we'll hear back from the Attorney General.
I've been refreshing my email because he said he could take care of it last night. Our Assistant Attorney General.
Okay.
So hopefully soon. I expected it by the start of the meeting, but. Folks, I do want to mention in our October 4th meeting, we brainstormed quite a few future presenters, VACO being this priority, Data Center Coalition being someone we want to hear from, who actually just hired a new Virginia executive director. Who may be able to come and speak to us. We have a lot of ideas here in this October 4th that different folks brought up. One, I want to follow up with each of you who made these recommendations for potential speakers. Robert, you mentioned somebody to talk about EVs. Paul mentioned a few other folks to include some EV voices, data centers. Greg offered that maybe someone from Dominion could come and talk about that long-term storage pilot. Lots of different ideas. Are there any more ideas that authority members have now for our next 3 quarterly meetings? Otherwise, we'll follow up with these and ask everybody to do their part to, invite connections, invite folks to come speak. New ideas?
What about someone who understands the issues regarding PJM interconnection reform?
I could make some recommendations for who to ask there. That'd be a great place to get an update.
Yeah, someone from PJM or
Someone from PJM, yeah.
I'm sorry, which question? Maybe I'm answering for you, sorry.
Not a question, just we wanted to have someone from PJM give us an update on interconnection reform.
That'd be great. Yeah, if you're in contact, we have something for you.
yeah. Okay.
Does the authority ever do field trips?
I think we have support for a field trip sitting right next to you.
Because the PGM, I mean, they would entertain a group like this and it'd be.
Oh, that would be fun. I would love to go to PJM again, yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. I did a field trip there once.
With AGC.
No, they're.
They're in Pennsylvania,
Yeah,
a couple hours west of DC.
Not the same distance. right,
Yeah,
To get here.
good track.
Certainly open to it.
I mean, likewise, interconnection perspective from Dominion or one of the other utilities, would also be helpful. We are facing interconnection challenges at both federal and state level, in Virginia. And, I think, we're kind of actively talking to Dominion, especially about, a number of our projects that sit in their queue and some of the challenges associated with storage and some of the, potential changes that they are contemplating, both for their, competitive solicitation that they run on an annual basis, and also just how they study projects in general. So, that one's probably a little closer to home for a lot of us and a more concentrated state perspective, but the PJM is obviously important too. And I think that kind of like plays nicely with the issue of land constraints as well, because you can have all kinds of friendly localities and friendly landowners, but if there's no interconnection service there, then it doesn't matter, right? And so to me, like land and interconnection are the biggest constraints that are gonna kill a project. And you gotta have both and kind of figuring out like where those sort of ideal kind of development regions fall within the state is important to figuring out like whether the conditions actually exist to meet the goals under the Clean Economy Act.
So on the topic of interconnection, and Ken, help me recollect this. We discussed the interconnection issues in April of last year, but that was just for small distributed projects.
That's not the distribution line.
Yeah, okay, so what Michael's proposing is maybe just a larger discussion on interconnection. Is there an office within Dominion that we could reach out to, discuss? Do you have a contact?
We certainly do. Let me chat with our development director, who's a former Dominion employee, and I bet he could probably propose some names and provide some contact information. And it might even be helpful to do a little bit of a panel, because there is, an interface between Dominion level interconnection and PJM as well. There's this wholesale market participation agreement process for distribution connected projects. And even, there's even projects that haven't gone through that process, there is often a need for Dominion to do affected system studies or also kind of request, outages on the transmission system to enable distribution level interconnection. So I think getting all those folks on a panel or something like that would actually be quite helpful.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, please explore those contacts.
Yeah.
Sounds great. We've got a lot of folks to reach out to. We do have our meeting set for the remainder of the year. Tentatively, the following meetings have space reserved in the General Assembly building. They were not able to accommodate us today, given session begins tomorrow, but we do have that ask in for their new facilities. Not to say we couldn't make a vote and change the location of a authority meeting or entertain a field trip, but that's kind of what we have on deck at the moment.
Is it worth considering an ad hoc meeting to revisit the report after the AG weighs in? We can do that. You can do that virtually, use one of your virtual meetings if you want.
I think that'd be wise. Would we? This is a question for the authority if we would need to take another vote depending on that, but let's keep that in mind as an option.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. We'll stay tuned on that and I'll let you know as soon as we get a response back.
Is there anything, I mean, to make forward progress? I know we lost a quorum, but, on finalization of the report so that it actually can be considered in this legislative session. I mean, the clock is, literally ticking. Should we take the administration's edits and comments into consideration and start generating a revised version with those, that input in mind? And then bring that to, whatever ad hoc meeting we may have subsequently to discuss it, or should we wait to hear from the Attorney General and then decide whether we want to do that or not? I don't want to spin wheels if it's not necessary, but I think there's some meaningful recommendations in there, and you know, the report is quite literally like the only thing that this organization does.
Yeah. I don't think I think that the admin, if they're gonna accept any changes, are gonna wanna see the exact ones they made. That's what I read from them. Didn't sound like there was any negotiation. I think it had. Policy office had it gotten all the way up to the chief of staff to the governor. So I don't think that they're gonna wanna do that again. I think they'll either want to see their version take place. And if the OAG says that's what should happen, fine, I think our hands are tied. Otherwise, we've got the report that we voted on. It's just my read of it, but I could be wrong.
Okay. I mean, if there's a middle ground to play nice, I'm okay with that. Kind of making some light changes. But
Yeah, well, I do want to say, I think either way, we remove the names of staff and the county names, like they requested.
Okay.
Those references. Cool. I'll entertain a motion without a quorum to adjourn.
Make that motion.
All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you all for making it out today, despite the rain. Really happy to have a quorum. I was going to be very upset.